For well over a year now, France's Yellow Vest activists have been making full use of their constitutionally enshrined right to protest against the economic policies of President Emmanuel Macron. But the often uncompromising response of the authorities has raised disturbing questions about the appropriate use of force to police those demonstrations. Juliana Ruhfus has been to investigate claims that France's democratic principles are being undermined.
March 2019. Yellow Vest protesters were back on Paris' Champs-Élysées, a famous street that they felt epitomized the political and economic system that had excluded them. Shops were broken into and fires lit. It had become a Yellow Vest strategy to protest without permission and in places of power where the government had never tolerated demonstrations. Protests that had been authorized by the government, they said, had failed to get results. The police responded with unmitigated force, using military-grade tear gas grenades and riot control guns.
That's you on the floor?
Ouais, c'est ça. Je l'ai pris dans la tête, comme tu veux, j'étais loin.
David Bredenstein says he'd been getting ready to leave when a rubber bullet from a police riot control gun took out his eye. The weapon, called an LBD-40, was developed for self-defense, but on this day, French police were using it for crowd control. It's designed to injure protesters lightly and should never be fired at the head.
Do you think he could have been mistaken between aiming at your head or your chest?
Impossible. En fait, ils ont tellement de viseurs. Leur viseur, en fait, on tire la tête, on vise la tête. Ils sont là pour blesser, pour dire, bah écoute, tiens, tu retourneras plus en manif. Donc c'est pour ça que moi je continue en fait ce boulot.
David and the other Yellow Vests have always insisted they are a social movement, desperate to get their voices heard. But France's president stayed silent when they first took to the streets. And when he finally spoke, it was in order to justify the use of full state force to crush them.
Là, maintenant, on a des gens qui ne savent plus pourquoi ils sont dehors, sauf détruire. Et donc, ce qu'on a décidé de faire, c'est d'adapter le régime d'ordre public. Et donc, la réponse est très différente de celle apportée à une manifestation.
Almost a year of confrontations have caused some soul-searching.
The right to protest is taken very seriously here in France, and in the wake of the Yellow Vest protest, there are growing concerns that it's being threatened. The ferocity of the police response, the weapons used, and the detentions of protesters all raise serious questions about tactics used by the French police.
Burgundy, France. Many of the protesters come from the country's neglected rural regions. We'd come to meet David Bredenstein, who explained how the Yellow Vest movement started in November 2018.
Et là, il y avait une cabane pour s'abriter, et puis un petit barbecue, petite table et tout, c'était bien. Quand à la pompe, on paye plus. Cher les tasses que le carburant, ce n'est pas la voiture, il faut changer le gouvernement.
Protesters began to occupy roundabouts after the government increased fuel prices, but anger had been building since the economic crisis 10 years earlier. The government had bailed out big banks, said David, but failed to support small businesses.
Le problème, c'est ça en fait, c'est trop de taxes en France, et à la base, les taxes, ça va pas aux bonnes personnes. Ça va pas aux bonnes personnes. Quand on voit une entreprise qui va embaucher une quinzaine de personnes, qui va payer des taxes à mort, il peut même pas augmenter ses salariés.
The protesters erected traffic blockades and disrupted an infrastructure which they said served the economic elite. And they had shared an anger at losing out.
Les présidents, en fait, ils n'ont plus aucun respect pour le peuple, en fait. Quand on voit les anciens, ils sont battus pour avoir des jours de congé, pour avoir tout ce qu'on a maintenant, les acquis de maintenant. On est en train de nous les retirer un par un, en fait.
It was in the cities where violence erupted and where the police were overwhelmed. Joined by militant protesters called Black Bloc, Yellow Vests carried out symbolic acts of destruction that shocked France and the world. The police, equipped with some of the most menacing weapons available to European law enforcement, were ordered to crack down hard. Gliev 4 tear gas grenades filled with 25 milligrams of explosives had rained on protesters, causing injuries and even loss of limbs. After 4 months, the Ministry of Interior estimated that around 1,600 police were injured, and on the other side, over 2,000 protesters.
Pour les manifestants, le silence d'Emmanuel Macron, c'était le silence du vainqueur, qui n'a aucun compte à rendre aux manifestants et qui ne propose que sa police. Et donc là, vous avez une escalade dans le soutien moral apporté à la violence, dans la légitimation de la violence des manifestants. Pourquoi les policiers ont-ils été, dans pas mal de villes, à ce point impressionnés par quelques dizaines de jeunes Black Bloc? Pourquoi un degré très élevé de gaz lacrymogène qui touche indistinctement les manifestants et les fauteurs de troubles? Tout ça, ça mérite réflexion et je ne suis pas sûr que le ministère de l'Intérieur aujourd'hui se donne les moyens de cette réflexion. Donc c'est inquiétant pour les manifestations qui vont venir.
France's police authorities declined to speak to us about their tactics during protests, but a police trainer said he'd talk if we disguised his identity. The trainer demonstrated the precision of the LBD. First, he aimed at the target's head. And then he shot the dummy squarely in the chest. Was it already broken or did you break it?
Non, c'est l'impact qui a cassé.
Maintenant.
Maintenant. Ouais, c'est 280 km/h, donc ça pique.
It wasn't the impact of the weapon that drew his criticism, but the failure of police officers to use it properly.
Les gens ne sont pas assez entraînés au niveau physique et au niveau tir. Et la fatigue, l'arme, elle monte comme ça et boum, ça part.
In 2018, 2 months before the Yellow Vests started marching, the National Audit Office had criticized the low number and poor quality of police training facilities. Our source says the riot control guns were nevertheless given to the insufficiently trained officers.
Alors les premières manifs, il n'y avait pas de LBD. Les Black Blocs arrivaient au contact des collègues. Les manifs après, le LBD est venu. Après, il y a eu un abus d'utilisation. C'était pam, 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 pam. C'était un peu le Far West.
Was this discussed a lot within police circles?
Mais bien sûr qu'on est conscient qu'il y a eu des erreurs de fait. Bien sûr, tout le monde est conscient. Donc c'est une trentaine de cartouches.
Police training like this should be funded by the Interior Ministry.
But why are they not doing it?
August 2019, Biarritz. President Macron had invited the world's leaders to the G7 summit, and the global media had gathered to follow the events. The French government had done everything it could to lower the risk of violent encounters with protesters, and we found the region under tight control. 13,000 extra police officers had been drafted in from across Europe to help provide security. Opponents of the G7 were being kept over 20 kilometers away on the border with Spain, where authorities had given permission for a march. One of those fronting it was 73-year-old Geneviève Leguet, a protester who had been seriously injured by the police at a Yellow Vest march 5 months earlier. After suffering a fractured skull and 5 broken ribs, she was a bit fragile, but ready to march again.
Alors moi je suis très heureuse d'être là avec les miens qui revendiquent depuis des années plus d'égalité, plus de justice sociale. On dit qu'un autre monde est possible et on en est sûr.
You're not worried. Vous n'avez pas peur?
Non, pourquoi? J'avais toujours dit que quand je sortirais de l'hôpital et que j'irais mieux, je manifesterai jusqu'au bout de mes jours parce que j'ai 3 filles et 5 petits-enfants et je veux me battre pour leur avenir.
The march set off towards the Spanish border. All were hoping it would unfold peacefully. The government's forceful approach to policing protests had drawn criticism, not just at home but also abroad, causing the president to strike a more conciliatory note.
Just before the G7 started, President Macron said that he was moved by the unacceptable violence suffered by protesters in France. He said that from now on his government would act with more transparency and more justice. So everybody's watching the protests here now to see what will happen.
In the run-up to the G7 summit, the police relied heavily on new legal powers given to them at the height of the Yellow Vest protests. They could now arrest protesters on the mere suspicion that they might pose a threat to public order, and a number of people had been put in detention.
Solidarité avec les 17 personnes interpellées qui sont actuellement en prison ici.
It's an approach to policing protests known as strategic incapacitation, controversial because people here were being arrested before any crimes had actually been committed. And then the 10,000 demonstrators reached the border.
The protesters are now crossing this bridge out of France and into Spain, which means that today, so far at least, there's been no violent confrontation with the French police.
But we'd heard that an unauthorized demonstration was planned in the nearby city of Bayonne by militant protesters, on the grounds that having to ask the state for permission to demonstrate infringed their constitutional right. Arrests had taken place throughout the previous night, and a heavy police presence was in place to stop an expected 1,500 militant protesters from reaching the city center. To our surprise, a protester who slipped through the security cordon agreed to speak to us on condition that we hide his face.
Do you think there's going to be violence today here in Bayonne?
Finally, I hope yes, because we want to push forward.
He told us he started out as a peaceful Yellow Vest protester, but that police violence radicalized him.
You have to be crazy to be in the field, and when you hear the flashball, it's like real bullets, you know? It's like if you stand on the open field and somebody's shooting you, you know? All the people now here fight like this, they are the crazy people, because we don't stop, we're done. We want everybody to join, we want to stop this fight and make the people power.
Suddenly, the police turned up.
Behind the camera person, we have a bunch of police now wondering what we're doing.
Yeah, we're gonna get police check in a minute, for sure. And maybe go in jail for no reason.
Everybody's bags are getting checked now behind me.
When we filmed them, they left, and the protesters started to justify the use of violence.
For climate or for freedom of the people, we have to fight and be ready to put our life. Like this, we will show to the people it's important, because it's not maybe today the revolution, but it will be. If we don't take Paris, we will take city by city.
Around the corner, the police were searching for anyone who looked like a threat to public law and order. And suddenly, that seemed to be us, as we were carrying gas masks and helmets to stay safe during the expected confrontations.
Do you want to keep it? Vous voulez garder?
ma sécurité?
Ici, toutes les manifs sont interdites. Vous n'avez rien à faire là. Donc vous soyez de la presse ou pas, vous n'avez pas de matériel de protection.
Nous sommes des journalistes, nous ne sommes pas
J'ai
les
bien compris, madame.
Oui.
J'ai bien compris.
Mais la presse n'est pas libre en France?
By now, other journalists were starting to film us. An officer took our kit, and we were told we could only have it back once the G7 summit was over.
C'est une pratique que nous, journalistes français, on connaît depuis un petit moment. Ça a commencé il y a 6 mois avec les Gilets jaunes, c'est-à-dire que sur les Champs-Élysées, dès qu'on pensait à un contrôle, on nous enlevait les masques à gaz et les casques. Sauf qu'il y a beaucoup d'associations représentant les journalistes en France, Reporters sans frontières, qui ont dénoncé ce mouvement. Et du coup, ils se sont un peu calmés avec les journalistes français, mais visiblement pas avec les étrangers.
Left without protection, it was hard to shake off the feeling that the police were not just trying to stop violent protests, but the reporting on it too. But we still made our way to the center, where the clashes were about to unfold.
We're actually super lucky that the wind is blowing in that direction because they've started with tear gas, and without the protection gear that we brought,
Only around 200 protesters had made it to Bayonne and passed the checkpoint. And within a couple of hours, they were contained by the police. In the end, it had been a small protest, especially by French standards. But arrests continued over the following days, and controversially, they included staff from a human rights organization. So by the time the G7 was over, civil society observers were voicing criticism that not only violent protest, but free speech and democratic rights had been suppressed too.
Pour l'État, pour la police, pour la puissance publique, vous avez deux manières de garantir l'ordre dans une manifestation. D'accord ? La première manière, c'est de réprimer tous les désordres et d'arrêter la plupart des gens qui sont sur les lieux des désordres. C'est très coûteux parce que vous risquez d'avoir plus de désordre quand vous tentez d'arrêter des gens. Vous avez les caméras qui filment et qui montrent quoi ? Oh, une poubelle qui brûle, une voiture qui brûle, un policier qui est pris pour cible. Politiquement, vous allez devoir vous justifier. Vous avez une deuxième manière de maintenir l'ordre, de prévenir les désordres. C'est de faire en sorte que la manifestation, elle n'ait pas lieu. Au cours du mouvement des Gilets jaunes, on a des chiffres jamais atteints, je pense, dans l'histoire de France. Jamais. 10 000 personnes ont été arrêtées. Des milliers de personnes ont été présentées à la justice. Donc ce sont des activités judiciaires répressives qui sont phénoménales.
In the Swiss Alps, over 600 kilometers away, a group of people had gathered to plan a different kind of protest. The region is home to Brugger and Tommet, the Swiss company that manufactures the LBD weapon used by the French police. We'd come to meet David Bredenstein again, together with several other Yellow Vests who'd all been wounded during demonstrations.
Nous sommes venus pour que demain faire part à Brugger et Tommet de nos blessures. Manifester notre mécontentement effectivement devant l'usine.
The men who call themselves the Collective of the Wounded showed us an LBD bullet. Here in Switzerland, it is classified as a weapon of war. Alain Hoffmann, a former army section chief, was hit in the neck.
Ça, pour nous, de nous être battus pour la France et d'être tirés après avec des armes comme ça, alors qu'on a défendu le pays, c'est incroyable.
Each of these men had requested the Inspector General of the French National Police to launch an investigation into their injury, but without much success.
Personne n'a réussi, il y a eu un non-lieu ici. Là. Moi, depuis le 16 mars, l'enquête n'est toujours pas commencée. En fait, le procureur, moi, ça va faire 6 mois, là, il n'y a rien.
Alain was angry that the authorities had failed to open an investigation into his case despite the mountain of evidence he'd supplied.
J'ai envoyé les photos où je suis sur le brancard avec des pompiers, avec des CRS qui étaient blessés à côté de moi. J'ai le papier de l'hôpital comme quoi on m'a tiré dessus. J'ai le médecin légiste aussi qui reconnaît que c'est un tir de LBD. J'ai mon bracelet de l'hôpital.
In fact, these men are not isolated cases. Since the beginning of the Yellow Vest protests, well over 300 investigations into alleged police violence have been opened, and less than a handful have been concluded. If any of them have been unfairly wounded, it seems the authorities are in no hurry to accept it. The following morning, the Yellow Vests set off towards the weapons factory. Olivier Parhoud, a Swiss Yellow Vests ally, wants to ban the export of LBDs on the basis that they are classed as a weapon of war here in Switzerland, but used against civilians in France.
Quand un pays comme la Suisse, qui est censé être un pays quand même neutre, exporte des armes, il faut vraiment qu'elle fasse attention à la suite qui est donnée à l'utilisation de ces armes. Et c'est malheureux pour le fabricant, parce que lui, finalement, ça lui fait une très mauvaise pub.
They were hoping that Karl Brugger, the weapons manufacturer's CEO, would speak to them.
Ouais, c'est très très important. Pour moi, au moins en fait, ce sera déjà un début de victoire. Qu'ils se rendent compte en fait de ce qu'ils sont en train de faire, etc. Qu'ils se rendent vraiment compte en fait qu'ils nous ont gâché la vie en fait.
But at the weapons factory, everyone had gone into hiding.
Comment tu te sens être ici?
Je me dis que l'arme qui m'a blessé, y a un ouvrier ici qui l'a fabriquée, quoi, je veux dire. Et ça sort de là, quoi. J'ai envie de leur dire, regardez, votre arme, elle est efficace.
Ouais, on est moins bien.
Merci.
Look, they're looking at us through the window up there.
Instead, the men took photos for their social media campaign. Frustrated by the failure of France's authorities to launch investigations into their injuries, they have clung to a faint hope that change may come from Switzerland.
Vous avez 2000 personnes qui ont été blessées par des policiers. 25 personnes ont perdu un œil, 5 personnes ont perdu une main ou un pied. Une personne est décédée. On compte, je crois, si j'ai bonne mémoire, 350 blessures à la tête. 350 plaintes ont été déposées contre des policiers. Je crois 2 policiers ont été effectivement condamnés. Et là, ça nourrit l'idée que, au fond, l'État se protège lui-même et ne se soucie pas des siens. Au contraire, l'État poursuit les citoyens qui revendiquent et protège les policiers qui font un usage illégitime, disproportionné de la force. Ça marque l'esprit public. Et ça nourrit la rancœur.
Bordeaux, September 2019. We'd returned to meet David Bredenstein one last time. He was back on the streets with a collective of the wounded to call on the government to ban the weapons that injured them. Antoine Baudinet, who lost his hand due to a police grenade, told us protesters had been unfairly branded as violent.
Et à chaque fois de se justifier, en nous disant que nous méritons ce qui nous arrive, en nous stigmatisant, en nous faisant passer pour des personnes violentes, alors que c'est leur violence qui a causé tout ce qui se passe en ce moment. C'est leur violence sociale, c'est la violence policière, c'est la violence de la justice. La police nous protège.
In November 2018, the Yellow Vests began their protests, believing that France's political and economic system was stacked against them. Almost a year later, they were still on the streets, this time with crosses for those who've been injured and who are waiting for justice. Few of them believed that the French state cares much about their welfare these days, let alone the issues that brought them out to protest in the first place.